Hey, good morning. Hey, Cynthia, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I wasn't sure if you wanted me to use my earbuds or if you can hear me okay.
I think I can hear you fine.
Okay.
So, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Just so you know, there's a bunch of people that will be kind of tuning in, and they will be muted, but they might type in some questions into the chat. So we may try to answer those as they come up. For you guys that don't know, that haven't been here before, that's kind of how we can do it. So if you have a question for Cynthia, type it in, and if it's not something crazy, I'll try to ask it. So anyway, welcome. It's good to see you. I can't remember the last time I spoke with you. I think it's been a while, but um, you know, do me a favor if you don't mind. Just kind of give folks your background for folks that aren't familiar with what you've been up to for the last 20 years or so. I think it's been.
Yeah, no, I think the last time we connected was actually you were a guest on our podcast. So always a pleasure to connect with you and your community. So I am trained as a traditional Western medicine nurse practitioner. My whole background's in ER medicine and cardiology. So I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. And I really believe that what started my path on a different journey was having a child with food allergies. It just got me much more interested, invested in the kinds of foods that we were feeding him. Obviously, I did a deep dive into functional nutrition, and then I really came from a place that it all starts from food, and it became increasingly more challenging to function in cardiology, writing scripts for things that I felt could be fixed with a change in their diet and lifestyle. And so I pivoted about 5 years ago. And being an introvert, I think it's always a good thing to challenge yourself. And so what I endeavored to do was to do a TED Talk just to challenge the introvert. And that's how I'm probably most well known right now. Is I've done a couple TED Talks and have a podcast. And now I'm much more passionate talking to people about how certainly changes in your diet have a much more profound impact than what most of the lay public, traditional media, and even the medical community is willing to talk about, except for those of us that are woke. And I sometimes hate the use of that word, but that's a little bit about my background. I would say I'm an adrenaline junkie that is now really focused firmly on talking to people about the value of food and eating less often.
Yeah, yeah. And when you refer to eating less often, I know you're very knowledgeable and interested in intermittent fasting. I think this food thing is, I mean, it really is shocking to me, particularly, and not to get too controversial, but in the heart of this pandemic, we've not had a national discussion about our overall metabolic and population health, you know, in this whole thing. And I find that to be very, very sort of almost sinister. I'd hate to say, but it's kind of crazy. And I just saw I just posted a state of my social media, what's left of it anyway, as I continue to see some of my stuff be throttled, I suppose. Plastic is now something people are going to recycle to feed to us. And so they've got a Merck pharmaceutical company has figured out how to turn plastic into food. And we may be eating plastic soon. We already eat sawdust and petroleum products and God knows what else. So why not, right? Do you have any concern? Because, I hear a lot of people, and I hate to, I'm talking about obesity is one of my least favorite things to talk about, even though diet clearly impacts that. But there's so much sort of animosity about, I can lose weight this way or that way, and I don't really care about that. But do you have any concerns about, it's all about, you've got to be in a caloric deficit. That's what the physics say. And damn, whatever the food is whatever it is. It seems to be the case. But what do you think about feeding people plastic? How does that fit into your? Can you intermittent fast away plastic?
No, and I sorry. Of course, I have. We're in a rental, a community, just waiting for our house to be finished. So I've told everyone to keep the dogs quiet. I have genuine concerns, not just for women, but also for men. The exposure to xenoestrogens or endocrine mimicking chemicals we know can dysregulate hormones in our bodies, can contribute to inflammation and weight gain. And I have to be honest with you, I want the calorie concept to die a painful death, because I think it has derailed so many better habits. One of the things on social media that really makes me bananas is when people say, if it fits your macros, and you'll see like a 22-year-old, no offense to any 22-year-olds that are in the group, but a 22-year-old, and they'll say if it fits my macros, and it's like 5 donuts and like 6 sodas, and I'm like, that isn't helpful for anyone. So our body doesn't recognize calories, it recognizes nutrients. There's biochemistry that goes behind the nutrients that we eat, and I just think our bodies are far more simple than we're giving them credit for. But I do genuinely get concerned when our bodies are exposed to more and more chemicals, especially things that are not natural. And plastics are on so many levels, whether it's the shampoo that we use on our hair, the body wash we're using on our skin. I think just going to the grocery store and the amount of things that are packaged in plastics, even if they're healthy foods like vegetables and fruit, cumulatively over time, that can be hugely impactful. And a lot of the work that I do with women, when we're looking at labs, and there are specific clues that I'm looking at, especially on things like the Dutch hormone test. And I'll just say there's something more to what's going on. Weight gain is not just a byproduct of what we're eating. It's the things we're exposed to in our environment, personal care products, and foods that are impacting our hormones in really harmful ways. And I think about, just as one example, that the rates of breast cancer are going up, and we know a very small percentage of breast cancer, a lot of female hormonal cancers, are genetic. The rest are environmental, things we're exposed to, epigenetic changes. And so I think on every level, we all have to be very conscientious about the foods we're eating, the environment we're exposed to, and the chemicals that we're using around our bodies, for sure.
No, I was just going to say, I interviewed a person the other day that was into the clothing industry, talking about sustainable clothing. And one of the things she had mentioned was that something like 70% of all the clothing we wear, the fibers are made out of, plastic, basically different various parts of plastic. And when you wash those clothes, all that plastic goes into the water supply. And so we're just continuing to expose ourselves to these things. But I wanted to say that you mentioned that, the 22-year-old on social media posting about how good they look, and they're eating this junk food, not being particularly healthy. And I remember when I was 20, I could eat whatever I wanted pretty much. And as long as I worked out, I stayed in pretty good shape, but that changes as time goes by. And so we've got someone in here asking about, we've got a lot of women, that are in this little bit older age category. Some are menopausal, premenopausal, postmenopausal, and they're wondering, do you approach things differently for those types of people as far as maybe fasting, or how does that work for you?
Absolutely. Actually, I just submitted a book for publication about women and fasting, because I think we do have to look at fasting from a different lens. I think that if you take men and postmenopausal women, and I'm not saying that they're the same, but I think when you take out the menstrual cycle piece, it gets a little less complicated for women. So women under the age of 35 that are fasting, I look at from a very different lens than women that are 35, 40, 45, 50. And so really taking into account, where is a woman in her menstrual cycle? There are probably about 3 weeks out of the month where fasting can be hugely impactful. But I generally don't like to see very lean women fasting every day. I don't like to see women fasting the 5 to 7 days preceding their menstrual cycle. Once their cycle starts, they can go at it. Then one of the other big caveats, and seems to be a larger issue for perimenopausal women, women that are 5 to 7 years preceding menopause and menopausal women, is the sleep piece. Sometimes the first sign that they're really heading into perimenopause can be a sleep disruption. And that can be a byproduct of, fluctuating amounts of progesterone being secreted by the ovaries. And so that can impact sleep in very negative ways. And I remind women that if you're not sleeping through the night, please don't add in fasting. Get your sleep piece dialed in, because if we look at fasting as one of many hormetic stressors, or one of many types of beneficial stress that we can add to the body, and that makes us ultimately stronger, healthier, et cetera, because we don't ever want to be too comfortable, right? But one of the problems that I see is that you'll have a woman who's not sleeping, that's maybe 40, 45. They think of fasting as being, the be all end all, and it can be, but in the context of, let's get your sleep dialed in first, so that you're in a position where your body is ready to change body composition, or ready to really capitalize on some of the benefits. What I see a lot of women doing is they buy into the CECO, the calories in, calories out. They restrict their food more, they over exercise, they are really overtaxing their hypothalamus pituitary axis or their brain as it relates to all these endocrine organs. And that can be problematic. So from kind of like a high view perspective, again, women that are no longer menstruating and men have a much easier time, generally speaking, with fasting than cycling women do. And if you're particularly lean, I don't generally recommend that people are doing really long fasts, that they're not doing protracted fasts. And a lot of that has to do with if you're in your, under 35 age range, your body is thinking about procreation more than anything else. And so I use the menstrual cycle as a barometer. If it's too much stress to the body, they may lose a cycle. And I always say that that's a sign that it's too much stress. And so we have to kind of back off on that. But that's kind of my general feeling about fasting. It can be hugely impactful, but you really have to check in with yourself and be honest about what's working or not working.
Yeah, and I think the stuff on the fasting, there seems to be, it kind of waxes and wanes with interest level. Some people say it's good, and some people change their mind. And it's kind of interesting to see that. When you talk about extended fasting, are you talking about these things that are 48, 72 hours and beyond, or what does it look like? I mean, intermittent fasting, most people understand it to be within a 24-hour period for the most part, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the different variations and why somebody might want to pick one versus the other.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think when I'm generally speaking about intermittent fasting, it's really, maybe you're fasting 16, 18, 20 hours out of the day. When I'm referring to extended fasting, it's generally more than 24. It could be 36, 48 hours. And there are certainly benefits. When people have a lot of weight to lose, sometimes doing a 2 or a 3-day fast can kind of reset their appetite, help them kind of get on board with the fact that they want to be eating less often. Obviously, digestive rest, a lot of people are looking for stem cell activation that you can get with these prolonged fasts. But I think the caveat is if someone is at a goal weight, if someone is already lean, it becomes a law of diminishing returns. And that's when I will tell people, I don't want you doing more than a 24-hour fast. In fact, Ted Naiman and I were talking about this, and he was saying like the incremental, and it's like maybe like a 5% uptick in autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process. And so really looking at what are your goals? What are your concerns? For some people, they really want the digestive rest. They really want to have a longer period of digestive rest. Maybe they've got 5, 10 pounds left to lose. So doing a longer fast episodically, even if it's 24 hours every other week to start, is certainly reasonable. But I think the other caveat is, and this is all these nuances related to fasting, a lot of it's anecdotal. And this is one problem, is that there's not enough research done on women. There's a good amount on men, plenty on rodent models, and plenty on obese menopausal women, not enough on women still in their cycling years. And with all these nuances, it's always in the context of checking in, how's your sleep? How's your energy? What's your menstrual cycle doing? And I think if you're really looking at it from those 3 lenses, really looking at those pieces, and even if you're a menopausal woman or a man, if all of a sudden your sleep goes south because you're forcing your body through a 48-hour fast, it's a sign that you need to stop. It's not okay that you get by with 4 to 5 hours of sleep. It's certainly not enough sleep. I tend to be really hard-nosed about the sleep piece. I'm like, there's just too many restorative processes that go on in the body at nighttime to not take full advantage. I'll give you a good example. Last night, for whatever reason, it was my birthday over the weekend. Thank you to those who put that in the chat. And last night it was I just, for whatever reason, didn't fall asleep, didn't stay asleep all that restfully. My blood sugar, I wear a continuous glucose monitor, has been higher than it normally is all day. And that is a direct impact from not getting a good night's sleep. So I remind people that we really want to be more deliberate about really checking in with that lifestyle piece as it pertains to adding in, these hormetic stressors, which can be very beneficial, but certainly not if you're not, dialed in on the sleep and the nutrition piece as well.
Yeah, I like that that you mentioned the fact of the diminishing returns, because you can get to a point where you've kind of more or less maxed things out, and then Ted talks about pulling different levers, and I'm the same thing. I said, I often point people towards strength training. It's like there's a point where it's weight loss, and then it's building and maintaining lean muscle. And so let's talk about some of those other things that you might recommend or consider as helpful. That some of it's common sense and obvious, but it never hurts to kind of just go into the rationale and how it really impacts people.
Yeah, well, I would say strength training above all else. I know that I'm very aligned with you and Dr. Lyons in particular on the fact that we need to lift weights. Sarcopenia is muscle loss with aging. It will happen if we don't do anything to help counteract it. So you have to eat enough protein. You've got to hit your protein macros. You need to lift weights. There's nothing wrong with taking a walk. There's nothing wrong with doing yoga. But being a cardio bunny or being obsessive about cardiovascular exercise, steady state exercise is not going to, impact you ultimately in a beneficial way. We want to think about muscles as a glucose reservoir. We want to be thinking about our muscles as, really this massive anti-aging benefit. So muscle needs to be a huge focus. So the nutrition piece is more protein as the primary focus. If you tolerate vegetables, great. I like non-starchy vegetables, healthy fats. If they're in your meat that you're already eating, fantastic. If they're not, then you want to make sure you're adding some to your diet. The sleep piece is a non-negotiable. I always remind people that much like, autophagy is this waste and recycling process with cells in the body when we're not eating, there's the lymphatic system that goes on at night, and that goes in and it requires so much effort and energy by the body. The only time that it can really do the cleanup work in our brain is when we're asleep. So, that's number two. I would say, being really strategic about stress management. I used to think this was a joke. I used to talk to my patients about how important stress management was. The older I get, the more I realize that makes a huge, huge impact. So most of us walk around being sympathetic dominant. We are stimulated all day long. We're in front of blue light devices. We are on our phones. We are connected to a tablet or a computer all day long. And we're just constantly inundated with information. So making sure that we are finding some restorative poses, or whether it's yoga, whether it's meditation, whether it's reading a book, connecting with your significant other, your kids, your dog, your cat, whatever it is. I wear an Apollo Neuro, which is a device that was created by a scientist that's designed, it was originally designed for PTSD patients, but they found that it actually works really well for keeping us in this parasympathetic, this rest and repose side. So I wear it on my ankle all day long. My kids tell me it looks like a home monitoring device for someone who's on home quarantine after being in prison, because that's exactly what this looks like on my ankle. But that all day long is just gentle tapping. It's even imperceptible. I don't even pay attention to it, but it definitely helps with kind of getting out of that, kind of sympathetic dominant mindset where we're running all the time. And our bodies aren't designed to be that way. The other piece that's important about more kind of restorative mindset relaxation is that our bodies can't digest food properly if we are sympathetic dominant. So that means if, we're not relaxed up here, digestion starts in our brains. I always like to remind people that, your gallbladder is not going to actually excrete the proper amounts of bile to help break down and emulsify fats. Your liver's not going to work quite as efficiently at helping to detoxify compounds that it's exposed to. And you're certainly not going to be in a position to be able to digest your food properly. So being really mindful, I think those are the big things that I think about. Unfortunately, they don't get a lot of focus because they're not sexy. It doesn't sound super exciting to tell people to go outside and get some light exposure in the morning, get your feet in the ground. But we know that the more aligned we are with the way that our bodies are designed to thrive, which means less processed foods, more physical activity, going to bed, they always say if you follow chronobiology, the way that our bodies are designed to thrive, we don't eat 2 to 3 hours before bed. We get up when it's light outside. Those kinds of things can make a huge difference in our quality of life for sure.
Yeah, that's one thing I definitely have seen that, if you decide you have some particular eating window, and I've never been this person that sits there with a stopwatch. I kind of don't, my diet sort of lends itself to infrequent eating, so I don't really have to worry about it. But I have found that if I can make a decision to eat earlier rather than later, I tend to fare better with an earlier meal pattern, and I often will eat my last meal of the day by 4 p.m. or sometimes 2 p.m. or something like that. And that works pretty well. There's a question in there about, because you mentioned the incredible importance of sleep, and I don't disagree at all about that. But some people have shift work, some people have irregular schedules, and they can't do that. How do you marry those? Let's say you're working on intermittent fasting and your sleep is all over the place. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to marry those ways that makes sense? Should you not fast when you're not sleeping well, or conversely, should you fast when you're not sleeping well? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do get this question often because I used to work shift work, so I know how disruptive it is. I think you really have to gauge a lot of whether they're physicians or nurses or NPs or other healthcare professionals, a lot of them find that it's easy to fast on days they're at work because it's one less thing to worry about. They just make sure they've eaten their last meal. They go to work. Maybe they're working overnight, or maybe they work all day and they come home and they break their fast. So I think it's first and foremost, it really depends on what makes you feel good. I would say if you're really struggling with sleep, maybe fast on the days you're off, if that's easier for you. The beautiful thing about fasting is there's no rigidity. You don't have to be rigid. You can be flexible. I think you really have to experiment to find what works best. I found that for shift workers, it depends on a couple factors. If they're getting home at 1 a.m., and I used to work 11 to 11 in the ER, which was a horrible shift. When I would get home, sometimes it'd be 1 o'clock in the morning and I would be getting hungry and I would try to convince myself I didn't need to eat at 1 a.m., but sometimes you did. And so I think you need to listen intrinsically to your body. If you're feeling like you're hungry and it's the end of a shift, I mean, go ahead and eat. Don't force yourself to fast till the morning if you're really feeling very, very intrinsically hungry. So I think that, it really depends on the individual, depends on how do they feel best. If they're fat adapted and they're at work and they can get through an entire day of work and they're just, drinking, tea or coffee and hydrating with water and electrolytes and they're thriving, then I think that's completely reasonable and feasible. What I do find is a lot of people feel like they then, when they get off of work, they feel like they want to eat and they'll eat a huge meal and then they feel uncomfortable. So sometimes I'll suggest maybe, if you have a break during your day, maybe having a small meal, a light meal, a meal that is easily digestible if you like fish or poultry. I mean, like a lighter protein, if that makes you feel better. Sometimes when people try to squash a lot of food into one meal, and women in particular, seems like men do really well with OMAD. Women, probably not so much. We maybe don't tolerate as much food in one massive portion as men do. And I just find as women get older, they tend to have smaller appetites. They're still eating, but they're having smaller appetites. So the answer to that question is follow individuality rules, experiment and find what works best for you. I would say if your sleep is okay and you're intermittently fasting, that is completely okay. We know based on research that you can get the benefits even if you're only fasting every other day, or if you're fasting 2 or 3 days a week, you're still going to get benefits. It's not an all or nothing phenomenon. And that's a common misnomer that a lot of the health pros that are out there I will see they're very rigid. And I'm like, no. The beauty of intermittent fasting is the flexibility piece and finding what works for you and your lifestyle and not feeling like you have to be rigid, because rigidity sometimes will bear the brunt of some pretty terrible behaviors that will come out of that.
Yeah, I've also just to further sort of put a nail on a finer point on that, I've seen some people discuss where, if you get into a rigid fasting schedule, say every week you're doing, 2 48-hour fasts, your body starts to adapt to that and you sort of lose some of the benefit. And so you want to maybe vary it up a little bit. Would you concur with that?
I would, just like we don't eat the same food every day. We don't do the same exercise every day. We want variety in our lives. Once we're fat adapted, once we are successfully doing intermittent fasting, I know even in my groups, that's one of the things I emphasize to them, put the training wheels on while you're learning these new strategies, then take them off and experiment. And I don't fast the same amount of hours every day ever. I actually enjoy the fact that I can flip things around. And some days I'm hungrier earlier and I'll break my fast. I don't ever, make myself feel badly if I do that. Some days I will eat more than others. I call it a feast day, really designed in some ways to kind of push me out of ketosis and give my body, maybe I'm having more protein, maybe I'm having a bit more non-starchy carbohydrates, but the variety is really important. And I think that applies to every, lifestyle change, whether it's the nutrition piece, whether it's the, exercise that you're doing. I'm sure, Shawn, that you probably are not lifting the same schedule every single day or every other day, whatever your workout program is. I'm sure there's a lot of variety because our muscles need that, our bodies need that.
Yeah, I do a lot of variety when it comes to training. Let me ask you, because you mentioned we kind of touched on circadian biology and there's some diurnal variation and many things, many hormones. There's one in particular called Ghrelin, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And my understanding is it tends to peak late in the evening or late in the afternoon, and that's where a lot of people struggle around that time. And I think there's a hormone component to that. And so, how do we? I mean, do you find any kind of, because a lot of times I find people that, particularly if they're trying to lean out or lose weight, and they struggle immensely at nighttime. This is when we traditionally see people digging in the cabinets, looking in the freezer for something. And then that's when they often, that little snack turns into a full on, 3,000 calorie feast or something like that. So how do we deal with some of these diurnal hormonal things? Is there a way to set ourselves up for success around those things?
Well, I think it's really, really important that we are looking strategically at macros. When we're putting our meals together, it's whether it's our first meal of the day, our second meal of the day, protein first. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient. You have to hit your protein, macros, because I find that when, women in particular, but obviously it applies to men as well, if they're really hitting their protein macros with their meals, they're full. I mean, they will, those leptin and ghrelin signals are kind of satisfied, the kind of satiety, appetite regulation is satisfied. The other piece is a lot of people eat in the evening because they're bored. So really looking at the emotional side of eating, which, I mean, we all have it. We all have habits that, I tend to lean towards dark chocolate. I'm not much of an alcohol drinker, but I have plenty of girlfriends that will say, well, nighttime is the only time I have me time. And so that's when they sometimes will sit down and kind of self-sabotage. Maybe they've done really well all day long. And I remind them that if you're hungry, you should eat. But most often than not, it's this emotional component, whether it's you're craving carbohydrate laden foods, you're just feeling like you're not topped off. And that's when I will say them, like, first and foremost, we have to make sure that we're really focused on those macros, hitting the macros during the day, so that when you get to 8 o'clock at night, you are not hungry, you are full, you are still digesting your dinner, you are satiated. That is hugely impactful. The other thing is if a woman is still, I hate to just harp on women, but the hormones really do drive a lot of this. If it's the week before your menstrual cycle, you may need to have a shorter feeding, a longer feeding window, meaning you may have 3 good sized meals and your body needs about 100 to 150 calories. I hate to use the word calorie, but your body needs a little bit more food. It isn't a lot more food, but really kind of leaning into what's going on hormonally. And then lastly, the sleep piece. We know that based on study research, if you're getting 6 hours a night of sleep or less, not only is your blood sugar going to be dysregulated, but we know that leptin is not going to be as suppressed as it should be. And so if you're not satiated, that can be problematic. And then lastly, I would say the other piece is not just the sex hormones, but if someone has a lot of weight to lose and they're leptin resistant, their brain may not be getting the communication signal that they're full, and they could have eaten a very large meal. They could have eaten a good sized lunch. And so knowing what your fasting insulin levels are, knowing what your fasting leptin levels are, I think is important, working with your primary care provider or whomever that is your local provider to really be informed. Because I find for a lot of people, they get very frustrated because the macros, they'll have everything dialed in. They think they're sleeping really well. They think they're managing their stress. They're trying not to eat at night, and then they're realizing their leptin is way off the charts. Their insulin is 15 or 20. And for comparison purposes, you want it like low, like anywhere from like 2 to 6 is about as high as I like to see it ideally. When you see someone's insulin level that's 15 or 20, I mean, this is a hormone issue. And so you have to really do the strategies to bring the hormones back in balance. And that in and of itself will help with, that nighttime eating. So I would say protein first, which I know everyone in this group, following Shawn is, very protein focused, but really hitting those protein macros, eating less often will really be beneficial. And then, kind of setting yourself up for success in the evening. Maybe you take a walk after dinner. Maybe you do an activity with your family so that you're not sitting in front of the TV, or you're not thinking obsessively about what's in the kitchen or in the refrigerator. And I would say the other piece that I think is important, if you have a trigger food, and it could be different for all of us, don't keep it in the house, or don't keep much of it in the house, because I find if you don't have access to trigger foods, you are less likely to binge or to go overboard. And I guess now, with the pandemic, there are all these, delivery services to home. I always say most, if not all food that can be delivered to your house, you don't want to be eating anyway. So really just being mindful about what you bring into the house so that you aren't exposed to those binge-worthy foods to begin with.
Yeah, let me, so you said you had a CGM. I'm just wondering what kind of insights you garnered from that. I mean, I don't wear a CGM, but I've checked my blood glucose, just, finger stick. And one of the things that most impressed me was the highest my blood glucose ever gets is after exercise. 'Cause when I train really hard. And so we talk about, well, we want your glucose always to be low, or maybe, and I'm like, well, then maybe exercise is bad for me. And I have a hard time sort of marrying those two concepts, that my blood glucose is high, but I'm exercising. How could exercise be bad with me? But have you found anything, I mean, any interesting insights around wearing a CGM for a period of time, and what might you be able to tell us about that?
Yeah, no, I actually think the metabolically flexible should wear a CGM on occasion because it's very insightful. For me, I'm low carb. I'm not ketogenic. I am very protein focused. Let me just be upfront about that. I did carnivore for 9 months after being hospitalized, and that healed my gut. I think that for me personally, it's been helpful to see how my body is impacted by certain foods. I'll give you an example. Again, I had a birthday over the weekend. I would not normally eat cake. I think flour, I don't care if it's gluten-free or otherwise, is like mainlining cocaine. For me, it spikes my blood sugar in ways that I don't normally see. My blood sugar went to 176 and came down within 30 minutes down to like 120. But I kept saying, I ate a steak for dinner. I had gazpacho before that. I had very few vegetables. It was just a wonderful filet. It was delicious. And I checked my blood sugar before I ate this piece of cake, and my blood sugar spiked. And I actually showed it on in IG stories because I was like, this is a good example. I'm metabolically healthy. My blood sugar recovered very quickly, but it also shows you I didn't feel bad. I didn't get sweaty. I didn't, get shaky. I didn't get sleepy. None of the things you would expect when someone has this blood sugar rise and then a precipitous fall, although not hypoglycemic. But for me, I think the thing that it demonstrated for me is that I need to have a good balance between healthy fats and protein. So for me, it's been eating some fattier cuts of meat when I'm, whether it's fatty fish or fatty meat, when I'm having meals, because my blood sugar seems to like that more. I don't like to see a lot of variability when I eat meals. And by that, I mean, no more than 15, I mean, at most 20 points in between baseline before I eat and afterwards. Generally, it's about 10 to 15 points. I think for a lot of my patients, what they find is that certain carbohydrates, even if they're healthy carbohydrates, if they eat a root vegetable or sweet potato, if they tolerate those things, they're surprised by the bioindividuality, meaning you can be a metabolically flexible person and maybe plantains don't work for you, or maybe sweet potato doesn't work for you, or you tolerate berries and you're fine with that, but you don't tolerate certain other foods. But it's always the carbs that seem to be impactful, or alcohol. That's another one that people are surprised by, because our body will actually prioritize metabolizing that first, and then it's like a total stopgap for everything else. So I do find that CGMs are really very interesting. I mean, unfortunately, I think you get a little obsessive about the data, but for many people, it's what kind of gets them finally really tuned in to looking more at the nutrition piece. Obviously, everyone in your community is already, very focused on the nutrition piece, but I think for even those of us that have healthy metabolisms, are hormonally balanced, there's benefit even if you have it for just a couple of weeks. In fact, for a lot of people, when we're trying to figure out why they're weight loss resistant, that's one of the first things that we'll do, just to say, hey, let's see if maybe because you're heading into perimenopause, and for men heading into andropause, you get these fluctuations. And we know that, as an example, estrogen is more insulin sensitizing, and progesterone's a little more insulin resistant. So for people right before their menstrual cycle, they may see changes in their blood sugar control. Same thing in perimenopause and menopause. They become much more insulin resistant heading into menopause, which is kind of a stinky thing, but there's all sorts of ways around that.
Yeah, I think, and you'd mentioned this, and maybe talk about this a little bit, but exercise after a meal, going for a 10-20 minute walk after, that has a pretty profound effect on mitigating the blood glucose response.
Yep.
Is that something you found?
Yes, and I laugh because when my husband and I were younger, we've been together for 20 years. We used to laugh at the couples, the middle-aged couples that would walk in the evening. We're like, that's so funny. Well, now we're that middle-aged couple that walks in the evening with our dogs. And we've just found it's a great way to to mitigate a blood sugar response. I always feel like when I look at my blood sugar pre and post, I'm always amazed to see, it could drop 20 points, and my blood sugar doesn't need to drop a whole lot. But how easy that is. It doesn't require equipment. You can walk outside, you get fresh air. I always say, go outside without your sunglasses on, because we know that there's benefit from the sun kind of setting and the retina, in your eyes, really, the receptors there that are, priming your body for sleep. I always say, starting your day with exposure to sunlight is important, and ending your day with exposure to sunlight will absolutely help with sleep quality. But also, the walks are great for multiple reasons. My dogs have never been so well walked since the pandemic started, because we do this every day.
Yeah, likewise, my dogs get about 6 or 7 miles of walking a day. It's pretty typical, first thing in the morning and last thing at night. And I do agree that, watching the sun go down, and you think about what would humans have done for fun, before books and TVs, and probably watching the sun was probably the most excitement they got, other than running from a lion or something like that. So there is something to be said about that.
Absolutely.
So protein, let's talk a little bit more about protein. Obviously, I've been a fan of protein since I've been about 14 years of age, I think. I've always been interested in lifting weights, and protein has always been a integral part of that. I still think it is. What are your thoughts on protein requirements? Do they change with time? Do they change? Do males and females need different amounts of protein? So let me hear about your thoughts on protein.
Yeah, I mean, it's my understanding that it's very similar, meaning that, we most of us aren't, well, maybe not within this context of this group, but as a society, most people are more carb focused than protein focused. And so I remind people that we are not eating enough protein. And I say to just about anyone, male or female, tell me how much protein you eat in a day, and I'll tell you that you're probably not eating enough. So really aiming for 30 to 40 grams per meal. For those individuals that are fasting and maybe they're doing 2 meals, I always say that's where you really want to push the protein. I generally will have, and I know I hate saying this, admitting this, but I'm going to be fully transparent. I usually have a shake at some point during the day, because it can be hard for me to hit 120 grams of protein every day. And so that usually gets me over to where I need to be. So threshold is, 40 to 50 grams. I tend to be very meat focused. I have a family of a husband and all boys, all teenage boys. So we eat a lot of meat. I always say we're carnivore-ish, because the amount of meat consumption in my house is reflected in our grocery bill every week. But I think it's really important for people to think strategically. And it's not that you have to be measuring out your protein. I just say, listen, you've eaten enough protein when you're full, so that you're not looking for more food when you're done with your meal. Really thinking about the fact that as we're getting older, wiser, more mature, we need to be thinking about the fact that we want to starve off sarcopenia. This muscle loss with aging is going to happen unless we are doing things to counteract that. And one of the most important things is hitting those animal protein requirements. And hopefully no one in the group is just primarily plant-based. I would imagine that's probably not aligned with your community, but it seems to be, as of late, that there's very much a plant-based agenda ongoing. And so I get questions like, how can I be low carb and hit my protein options? And I'm like, you can't. I mean, there's just no way. They're inferior. There's no way you can take 6 cups of quinoa is equivalent to like a 6-ounce steak. And I'm like, the amount of caloric intake and the macros would be so off, and so many carbs, that would be detrimental to your metabolic health. So really focusing in on those animal-based proteins. And I find for a lot of people that really generally means, bison and beef and elk and antelope and poultry, if you like that, fatty fish are always really great options. But protein is first. Protein is primary. I even tell my teenagers this. I'm like, if you've eaten enough protein, you will not be hungry in an hour, even though your metabolism is ridiculously fast. Yeah. I'm seeing everyone's like, and I love eggs. I forgot about eggs. Eggs are like one of my favorite things to eat. We eat like dozens and dozens of eggs every week.
Yeah, that's something that I do with my kids. I've got 4 of them, ranging from almost 9 to 15. And, if I, anyway, I can load them up on as much eggs, meat, steak as possible, then I don't have to listen to them asking for food every 15 minutes, because that's
Yep.
just a parent's
Yep.
hack, you get them there and load them up on that. And it does seem to work.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about fat, because, obviously there's a lot of, I would say, opinions, and and there's a lot of science on that too, about fat. So are you concerned about eating particular types of fat? How does fat fall into your?
I am very pro fats. I think it really depends on the person. There are some people who do better with a plant-based fat. And when I say plant-based, I'm not referring to the bastardized form of plant-based, but like an avocado or coconut oil. Some people do better with olive oil versus animal-based fats like lard and tallow. The only thing that I speak kind of vehemently against are seed oils. And, for anyone in the group, I'm sure Shawn does a great job educating everyone, but seed oils are about the worst thing you can put on your body. And that's the classic vegetable oil, canola, soybean, safflower, sunflower. And I tell people, I don't care if you still eat something in a box, but make sure you read the box, because if you try to avoid seed oils, that's going to eliminate almost everything in the processed foods that you find in the grocery store. Seed oils are inflammatory. Dr. Kate Shanahan talks a lot about the influence of seed oils on chronic inflammation, driving the obesity epidemic, because people are prone to overeat carbohydrates in that setting. And so I just say, if you can avoid seed oils, the sad thing is, thinking about as a society, the number one consumed fat in the US diet right now is soybean oil, which is a direct reflection of the degree of processed foods that we're consuming. And the other piece is, when you're thinking about linoleic acid, I mean, you do find that's an omega-6. You do find some of that in some animal proteins, but that's very different than the processed seed oils. And they tend to drive inflammation in the body. And with so many people that are dealing with chronic pain, autoimmune disorders, et cetera, I'm like, the first thing I say to kick out of their diets is to really just be reading everything. Like when you go to a restaurant, ask what your dressing is made with, or bring your own, or make your own, or advocate for your own product. My kids are always embarrassed, because if I want dressing, I will bring my own. I don't eat a lot of dressings. I usually make everything fresh at home. But if I'm out at a restaurant, I am the person that will ask, what are you cooking my steak in? And you'd be surprised how many times even nice restaurants where they're cooking your steak in like a nasty, oxidized seed oil, which, it's kind of like you take this beautiful piece of meat and then they throw it on a skillet or a grill, and then they throw a bunch of like seed oil on top of it. And it's frustrating. But I would say, as a rule, I am pro high quality fats. We know that they're instrumental, they're really critical. And I was certainly part of the brigade during my training that, low fat, non-fat. I mean, the things I used to tell my ER medicine and cardiology patients make me cringe now, but now I know better, as I know you do as well.
Yeah, and yet you have folks like Walter Willett singing the praises of seed oils is the the second coming of Christ or something like that. We should be always eating seed oils as opposed to everything. Why are I mean, there's a relationship between seed oil consumption and LDL production. And I think we have such a myopically focused on health. I don't, like I said, I'm not going to tell somebody that cholesterol is irrelevant. I've never said that, but it's interesting to me that when we look at health and we look at, say, some of these lab markers that, things we think are either signs of health or not, glucose, inflammation markers, so on and so forth. If all of those go in one direction and we have one that goes in the other direction, what does that mean? Does it mean that, we're healthy, but we're not healthy? Can you explain that to me maybe?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's a lot to unpack. I think you can have quote unquote high cholesterol and it's not really a reflection of a metabolic disorder. I myself have high LDL, I mean, high by all Western medicine standards. And so, the unpacking is, my healthcare practitioner looked at me and said, I doubt, given how good everything else looks, that this is an issue, but let's do a VAP. Let's look at this particle size. And so, that's the small, dense, atherogenic are the ones that you're really concerned about versus this light and fluffy. And sure enough, I had a lot of light and fluffy. So much less atherogenic, much less concerning. But how many people are being put on statin agents because they arbitrarily see one marker, one indicator on a lab, and it's this knee-jerk response? My understanding is that there are people called lean hyper-responders. I don't know if you are familiar with Dave Feldman's work, but he has kind of convinced me that is perhaps a likely explanation, that this is just what my body produces in response to what I'm eating, but it is not atherogenic, it's not pathologic. And I think we have to look at things in context. And again, this is nuances. I think on so many levels, we're so fixated on one marker that we forget about all the other evidence. If your insulin and your leptin and your glucose and your inflammatory markers, your blood pressure, et cetera, look excellent, you're metabolically flexible, you're at a healthy weight, you sleep well, your sex hormones are balanced, I'm a lot less concerned about that marker. Now, in the setting of when I worked in cardiology, we had a lot of people with metabolic syndrome, very high triglycerides, in the setting of low HDL with high LDL, and a lot of inflammatory markers, high blood sugar. that is the picture of metabolic inflexibility. That is the picture of someone that we need to dig a whole lot. Sorry, I have a dog who's trying to get out. That is the picture of someone that I would look at very differently. So I think it's always conceptual, and then it's also context, those nuances of what else is going on with this patient. And I don't think we know enough about these lean hyper responders. I know Dave is in the midst of, funding some research in this area. Certainly a lot of my cardiology colleagues still sit on the fence. It makes them very uncomfortable because they see this direct correlation. Well, if LDL is high, then you're doing everything wrong. You need to eat low fat, you need to eat low cholesterol. In fact, I used to get yelled at when I would see someone's cholesterol and statins go below 100 total cholesterol, and I would get yelled at. And I would say, that's a pathological marker if we have cholesterol too low, because if you think about these lipid bilayers, these, every cell in our body has a lipid bilayer. And if cholesterol goes too low, that can be pathologic, and also be a marker of morbidity and mortality. And so for a lot of my cardiology patients, when I would try to present that evidence to my attending, they would sometimes look at me skeptically. They're like, yeah, but this evidence-based medicine thing. And I just said, I think sometimes we have to think beyond just what's been done in a research trial. I think we need to look at anecdotal evidence, then push for additional evidence to demonstrate that we need to think outside the box. Because I think about the net impact of some of these medications that, gosh, I was prescribing for 16 years. And I remind people, I'm like, I had this really amazing professor that was at NIH, and she had horrific cholesterol numbers. I mean, her entire lipid panel was terrible. And she would talk to me about, she said, do you understand what statins do? And I would say, yes, it reduces inflammation, it stabilizes plaque. And she said, beyond that, think about what it does to the mitochondria. Think about what it does, think about mitochondrial dysfunction is really prevalent in anyone over the age of 40. And so I did this deep dive. The more I understood about statins, the more I was like, yikes, I really want to avoid, if at all possible, prescribing these unless I absolutely have to. And in some situations, because of where I was clinically, that was part of the standard of care. I hope that I answered that, at least, in the best way that I can. I think that the answer is really, we don't know, because the research is so focused on the reason why we have, these escalating rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease is because of fat. And if you look at Ansel Keys' work from 50 plus years ago, we know that all the information was suppressed about sugar. And so there's a lot more going on than people are willing to really admit.
Yeah, it's clear that there's a lot going on there. And I think that, that the work that Dave's done, and I'm very familiar with Dave. I've talked to Dave many times. I've had dinner with Dave, and him and Spencer Nadolsky and someone else are trying to get a study funded looking at this lean mass hyper responder. Interesting. Hopefully it'll show something. It'll teach us stuff. So you mentioned the 16 years prior to where you were working in the cardiology field. How do you find that your impact has been since you sort of started focusing more on nutrition now, as far as difference in the outcomes and in the people you're seeing, and then your own personal satisfaction? How's that been different for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I would say that I feel like the real work is what we're doing right now. Talking to people about lifestyle medicine, talking to patients about nutrition, because it all starts with food. That's what it comes down to. I don't care what background someone has. Almost everything can be improved by changing what you eat. The food you put in your mouth could be the biggest poison or not. And so I always say that it all starts with food, and that recognition by a healthcare professional could not be a more powerful motivator for change. So from my perspective, I feel like I make a much larger impact in this role. Even though I'm this, kind of quiet introvert, I think that on many, many levels, being in this position is making a much larger impact than sitting in a clinic office or being in a hospital. Even though I miss and love, direct patient care, I think that we're able to make a much larger impact by, being in a position on social media or speaking events or connecting with communities to really encourage people to do the hard work, because the hard work is changing what you eat. The hard work is changing the lifestyle piece, because we've conditioned far too many people that a pill is going to take away their problems. And really, it all lies within. Like, if we're willing to, it could start off with like baby steps. Maybe someone, is eating, I think the average statistic I read most recently patients are eating a sugar sweetened beverage or food 16 to 17 times a day. So it's no wonder we're dealing with an obesity epidemic. But even if you eat less often as a start, even if you replace your sodas with water, even if you choose to eat a larger portion of protein with each meal, I mean, those small changes have a huge net impact. And I think as people start feeling better, they're more willing to do more of the hard work. And then I think once you get to a point where you're feeling great, you're like, I'm never going back to what I was doing before. I always say you can never unsee. So it would be impossible. I'm sure you probably are the same way. It would be impossible for you or I to practice clinically in the environment we used to be in, because we just know so much more now. And I think it's far more powerful to really to empower individuals to, change lifestyle, change your diet, change the way you sleep, change the way, you focus on your physical activity, and stress management. And, those pillars are huge. I mean, that is going to have a much larger impact than taking, medications that have a slew of side effects, many of whom are permanent. I'll give you an example. My father is in his late 70s and has been on a statin for about 15 years. And he, prior to being on a statin, was just an incredibly smart, capable person. And I've just watched his health dwindle. He's not an unhealthy weight. He doesn't eat a bad diet. He gets plenty of sleep. He's retired, but I've watched his cognitive status really diminish. And so it's been very sad to watch that happen. And I think it's a direct reflection of being on a statin. And no matter how I could present information 15 different ways, he is not ready for the message, nor will he accept it. But I always say, Dad, I wish you could see what I see, because it's really unfortunate.
Yeah, it is tough to see. Back to, you mentioned your response with cake and a CGM, you talked about flour. I had a nice talk with a guy named Gabor Adrossi, he used to be a food scientist engineer. And one of the things one of the points that came to me is, we're eating powders now, and human digestion is not designed for powders. I mean, if you think about how would I take food in the wild and turn it into a powder, I couldn't do that without a processing facility. And so that surface area of energy has been exposed more quickly than our incretin hormones can deal with. And I think that's why we get these unusual blood sugar spikes. But that's just a comment that this came to my head. I wanted to make sure I just talked about that. But so do you find that doing what you're doing now is getting easier or harder? Because I've seen a greater desire for perhaps sort of closing down discussions. It's not like, I've been throttled many times on social media. My Twitter account was completely suspended. I am, a little concerned. Are you experiencing? Obviously, a lot of people don't agree with a low carb message, or God forbid, eating more meat message. What has been your sort of experience in the general community and within maybe the people that you maybe some of your colleagues, do they still sort of push back on that? Are you finding it difficult to get the message out?
It's interesting because I got attacked by a vegan cardiologist a couple weeks ago, basically telling me that I was endangering patients' lives by encouraging metabolically healthy people to wear CGMs. And it was so vicious, and I'm sure you probably know who this individual is. And then all their cronies came after me. And I just thought to myself, when have we been in a position as healthcare professionals that we don't want to empower our patients? And so I do feel like there are certain topics I personally can't talk about on social media. That distresses me enormously. In fact, when I've had a couple recent guests where I've had to say to them before we start recording, we can't talk about vaccines, we can't talk about COVID, because I'm recognizing certain things, and my team does SEO optimization. And so they always give me updates on, these are the topics to avoid, so that you're not dealing with major censorship issues. But it also troubles me enormously that the suppression of information, the suppression of voices. Certainly on Twitter, I know that, when your account was suspended, all of us in that kind of space, the health focused, clinician space were horrified, because we kept saying, what's coming next? If they're coming after someone who has a very pro health, pro meat stance, if you can't be able to speak openly and honestly about what you perceive are some of the problems and ramifications of some of the mindset, I think this plant-based vegan agenda, that is clearly being fueled. It was almost like a systematic attack because it was multiple friends of mine, physicians, nurses, etc., in the low carb keto space that were all attacked the same week. And then the following week, this vegan cardiologist came out with this, pro pharma drug that's coming out to help people regulate their blood sugar. And I was like, oh, now I get it. You don't want people to be empowered. You just want them on another drug. So I do find that the kind of suppression of alternative perspectives, I feel like a lot of people are getting off of Facebook, feeling like they're being censored on Twitter, feeling like people are being censored. Instagram seems right now, at least from what I've been able to see, doesn't seem to be quite as controlled in terms of what's being monitored, but I'm sure that could change. I know people are afraid to even spell certain words on social media. And, that's not the United States that I feel like I've grown up in. But unfortunately, I feel like there's very much on social media, there's a slant. I do have a friend who's a physician who was hired to kind of create content for Facebook that is aligned with evidence-based medicine. And so, although I can't disclose who this individual is, when he told me that, I said, oh, so if it doesn't fall in alignment with what you are finding, then it might fall outside those parameters and some stuff will get flagged. And I think that's concerning. I didn't think I'd be living in an age where there would be this much divisiveness and just pettiness. There's a lot of pettiness that goes on. And that I find incredibly concerning, and certainly something that I'm hoping that we aren't just seeing the tipping point. Like there's more to come where people are going to feel like they can't get their voice out, whether it's on a podcast or in an informal group, or being able to write a post on social media without feeling like your information gets flagged and then no one can even see it. Like the visibility goes from being visible to invisible almost instantaneously.
Yeah, it is disturbing. Anyway, well, Cynthia, this has been a very informative and delightful discussion. We've run through an hour, and that's typically what we do. But let folks know where they can find you while you're still there. Assuming you don't get taken down too. But where do people go to find out more information about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So my website's probably a great place to start, www.cynthiathurlow.com. I have a podcast that Shawn has been a guest on called Everyday Wellness. I'm on Instagram, Twitter for now until they decide to do something otherwise with me. Technically, I am on TikTok, although not a whole lot. Facebook, there's a free Facebook group I have there talking about intermittent fasting, and definitely have some interesting discussions there. Trying to stay above the fray as much as possible. But even people like myself are getting attacked, really for no reason at all. Certainly, if a CGM is triggering other clinicians, then we have some major problems.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks, folks. You guys have a great day. We'll see you back tomorrow. We got Frank Mittel on. Should be another good one. Okay, guys.
Awesome. Thank you.
Have a great day. Take care.
You
Bye-bye.
too.